When we think about the ways that poverty often presents itself, many of us envision visibly poor, the unhoused. But the realities of poverty are a layered, intersectional, and complex experience. And so are the solutions to reducing poverty. Hey there, you're listening to The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. I'm Brittany Brander, and in this series, my co-host, Scott Crockett, and I explore Alberta's big challenges, celebrate stories of growth, innovation, and prosperity, and discover bold ideas to make life better for Albertans. On today's episode, we are joined by Executive Directors Meaghon Reid of Vibrant Communities Calgary and Erick Ambtman of End Poverty Edmonton to discuss Alberta's poverty landscape. We discuss the myths and realities around poverty and how it presents itself, pathways into and out of poverty, the challenges of the rising cost of living on the most vulnerable communities, and address some of the tough questions within the poverty space. We also reflect on how poverty in Alberta has changed over the pandemic, the crippling cost of loneliness, and the real solutions that we can adopt today to combat poverty, one person at a time. If you found this episode interesting or insightful, let us know by heading to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and give us a quick review and a rating. Now, on to the show.
Well, welcome back to the show, Erick, Meaghon. We're so grateful to have you join us once again. So last time you were both on the show, this is like July 2020. So much has changed since July 2020. So we'll get into the last 3 years and the impacts on people experiencing poverty. But can you both just take a moment to just introduce yourselves and tell our listeners a little bit about what each of your organizations do? So Erick, I'll start with you.
My name is Erick Ambtman. I am the Executive Director of End Poverty Edmonton. The goal of that organization, or this organization, is to end poverty in Edmonton. We go about doing that mostly through advocacy on systems change and sort of piloting bold, big ideas to hopefully impact poverty reduction. And I guess we also do a lot of convening, bringing people together to solve audacious problem.
Meaghon, what about you?
So Meaghon Reid, I'm the Executive Director of Vibrant Communities Calgary, and we very much do what End Poverty Edmonton does in Calgary. So we want to change the systems that hold poverty in place, and we do that primarily through research to really understand poverty, because we often don't in our country understand what it really is. Policy, advocacy, and then convening, bringing people together and getting them swimming in the right direction. So it's fortunate that Erick and I get to stay at a really high level and to work with the sector and business as well in this way.
Meaghon, it's interesting that you began as part of your intro talking about how we don't necessarily totally understand poverty, because that's actually where we wanted to start the conversation today. I think many of us have an image in our minds of what poverty looks like, but I think the experience can be more nuanced than that. So maybe the first question, and pose it maybe to you first, Meaghon, would be, how do you define poverty, and how does it present itself, in our major cities in Alberta?
So there's a lot of different ways to define poverty. Erick and I often say poverty is always about income, but it's not just about income. So traditionally in the media, we would look at poverty lines. We could do that through a low income measure. We could do that through a market basket measure. We slice it and dice it by looking at a single family, a lone parent of 2 children, a family of 4. It's always below about $55,000. But for us, we like to look at poverty through a lot of different dimensions. Right. And for me particularly, I think it's about the feeling of poverty that we rarely capture when we're talking about it. Like poverty is not just your income. It is a feeling. It is a way of being. It's really hard, and it's difficult, and it's hard to touch and see, and it's desperate. Right. And I think the feeling of poverty is something that we shy away from in conversation. So when I talk to people who are living in poverty, and that's a big part of the work that both Erick and I do, it is about understanding what poverty is feeling like right now for people. And it takes up a lot of headspace. You can't think about your options or prosperity because you are thinking about your survival. in that day. And there's a lot of anxiousness and depression and mental, health issues that come with that because it is all consuming. And so that lack of choice, that lack of being able to think about your prosperity, that lack of agency or control, to me is much more representative sometimes of poverty than those income numbers.
It's so great that you started talking about it that way, about how it feels. As we were prepping for this, Brittany and I had a number of conversations about this, about how we sort of define poverty and how we think about it. And it became clear really quickly that income is not a good enough way or a sufficient way to look at it, because lots of people may have a brief period where their income's kind of low, and that doesn't necessarily have all those same impacts that you're talking about and those feelings associated with it too. So the next place I want to go is talk to us about the pathways into poverty. Is that something that you see in both your work? And what do those look like? How do people especially in a relatively affluent place like Alberta, find themselves in poverty? Erick, go ahead.
That'd be such a big question. Like, it's such a big question. The face of poverty is working poor. So people who are working very hard to, like Meaghon said, survive. And that survival mode really doesn't allow you to thrive in any way. And so you get into this perpetual state of survival. And it is people just trying to get to tomorrow. And I don't know that there's exactly a pathway to poverty, but often circumstance will dictate what opportunities exist for you, and then the difficulties in making it through to tomorrow. But I think the reality is, like, circumstance often dictates that you'll find yourself in poverty, and starting with that sort of low income leads to a series of other issues, and often people find themselves trapped there and generationally trapped in poverty situation.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, because I think since we last talked, there's been a more of a public awareness of the role that race, for example, plays in poverty, and why people are in that sort of chronic poverty as opposed to transitory poverty, right? So it's intergenerational. In poverty, Edmonton wants to end poverty in a generation. We can do that because it's a generational game, right? And so, the more likely you are to be in poverty, in a chronic poverty situation. If your family was in that situation, you were more likely to be there. And then there's a lot of things that can keep you there that you have no control over. And that's the thing that sometimes we miss when we talk about poverty. It's like, well, if someone just worked hard enough, or my cousin, brother, uncle, whatever, got themselves out of poverty, and therefore you can do it too. That's not how that works.
What are some of those things that are beyond people's control? How do you respond to that person who says, oh, why don't you just work harder? If that person just worked harder, they'd probably get themselves out of poverty. I know somebody who did.
Yeah. So that wraps into the three discourses of poverty, right? One is the sort of, if we had more jobs, then we wouldn't have poverty. And the second one is, if it's a behavior judgment, if you just worked harder, then you would get yourself out of poverty. And the third one, which of course that we subscribe to, is that sort of social justice systems hold people in poverty. No one person can sort of change that in a significant way that changes it for a population. So definitely race is a huge factor in poverty. I would say particularly in Calgary. If you look at who's experiencing deep poverty right now, it's racialized communities and Indigenous communities in our city. And Erick, I imagine it's the same there in Edmonton.
Yeah, for sure. That's an aspect. I think it is a myth, though, that you can work your way out of poverty. A good example would be refugees, who've been through like extreme traumas. You can just work your way. You can't work your way to having a high school education if you were forced out of school in grade 3. Like people who are in poverty, the vast majority are working extremely hard. They have their bootstraps up and are working very hard. That's not sufficient to get out of poverty. We talk a lot about privilege in a really way that sort of comes across as very judgmental, I think. But the reality is, like, I had the opportunity to get a master's degree from the London School of Economics. Poverty was highly unlikely to be in my future, highly unlikely. Whereas somebody who's growing up in North Edmonton, who is being sort of enticed to join a gang, or maybe is able to avoid that, but drops out of school in grade 10 to get a job to support her family. What are the prospects for that individual? Poverty is highly likely to be their future, and so circumstance dictates a lot of this. And I think what Meaghon and I work in a space where we're trying to create an environment where that circumstance won't dictate your outcome or your future, where there is much more opportunity for those who, want to work hard and are working hard, but the outcome of that hard work and labor leads them out of poverty as opposed to keeping them in poverty.
So let's take maybe a step closer to home a little bit and look at the landscape of poverty in Alberta. Can you each talk a little bit about what poverty is looking like today in Edmonton and Calgary, and if you can, outside of the larger centers?
I mean, I can certainly speak to it in Calgary, and I'll be very interested actually to hear Erick's answer to this, because sometimes we compare and contrast our cities differently. So I'll be interested to hear Erick's answer. I mean, Calgary certainly has a challenge sometimes in always being one of the top 3 most unequal cities in Canada when it comes to the wealth gap between people in poverty and people with extreme wealth. And so it does get confusing sometimes when we talk about the wealth and prosperity that's in Calgary or Alberta generally. Doesn't resonate, I think, with a lot of the population who are living in poverty or who feel close to poverty. And the reason for that is that gap that we have. And we're always in the top 3 as a city. And that is something that
of Canadian cities, is that
of major Canadian cities needs to change. It's a really frustrating thing because until we sort of start to combat that in a really substantial and meaningful way, we're always going to be in that top 3. And so that's not a distinction as a city that we are particularly proud of, even though we have lots of other accolades that we've seen come over the past few years about Calgary being one of the most livable cities. And you look at The Economist, it's a challenge with how, so I think a lot of us believe that too, but it's a challenge with how that resonates in terms of how people in poverty or even, middle incomes experience the city. It looks really different, not as livable. We'd also, I would say, if I'm thinking about the top priorities right now, we have a couple of parallel crises, I would say, that are happening in Calgary. One is around affordable housing and housing stock. So in terms of households that are spending over 30% of their income on housing, that's 82,000 households in Calgary. That's a lot. Our rental availability is less than 1% in Calgary. So it's really challenging to find something, and our wait lists are quite high. And that is a phenomenon that's being seen around the country. But for Calgary, I think it's incredibly concerning because we do have a lot of people coming into Calgary, which is fantastic. It's a great benchmark of one of our successes. Business Council of Alberta, profiles sort of the influx of people that we have. That's fantastic. And we are wondering how that's affecting people who don't have access to housing or who aren't able to access resources as easily because of that influx as well. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about right now in Calgary.
And what about in Edmonton, Erick?
Poverty tends to be a lot more visible in larger urban centers just because of the homeless population. So that tends to be how we think of poverty is in an urban center as homeless people. But in smaller centers like a Camrose or like a Grand Prairie, there are people who are homeless. I think the great unifier or what's consistent across all municipalities or all communities is the isolation that poverty tends to breed. And so I think that's the commonality. You can be in a small, like a Vermilion, and have a house, they don't have social housing to the degree you would see in an Edmonton or a Calgary, but you'd have a house, but you'd be facing similar circumstances. So on income support, which is a very low income and struggling with the same issues, but maybe not dealing with homelessness to the degree that you see in an urban center. But poverty is poverty. I mean, it breeds the same issues for people regardless of the size of your community. It just tends to be, I think, a little bit more visible in a larger urban center.
And give us a sense, just directionally, since we last talked early pandemic, are things getting better or worse in our largest urban centers? What direction are we moving in on poverty?
It's a hard question. I don't know if it's better or worse. It's different though. It looks really different. So prior to the pandemic, and Erick and I started in our positions, I started just before the pandemic, and then Erick started just after the pandemic, which is a fascinating time to start.
You've had no normal times probably in either of your I'm making air quotes for those who are just listening audio wise, but no normal times.
No normal times, absolutely. I think the benefit though, or the perspective that might give both of us is that we can see in some pretty great detail how it's changed even in the past few years, because that's been our only reality. And so I think prior to the pandemic, it was much more a conversation about like the economics and the dollars and cents of poverty. It was a math question. How many houses do we need? How much do we need to increase wages? What does that look like relative to the population? So I think there was a lot of math happening. And now I think we've got different pressures when it comes to how poverty looked like because of the past few years. Mental health has entered into the equation in a really significantly different way. How the sector is equipped to respond and to support people who are living in poverty or going into poverty, that looks incredibly different than it used to. So that's a huge variable that has really shifted over the past few years. And then we've had shifts in government. So both Edmonton and Calgary, of course, have had a change in city council in that time. We've also had shifts in government priorities at the provincial level as well. And so how we're responding to this long game crisis and inflation and affordability post-pandemic, if you will, has made it so that this long game feels really different. To me, the long game of this feels harder. The upside is that I think the sensitivity of the public to really understand what this is greater. I think the empathy is greater, even though people are tired. And I do think there is a feeling of enough already. Like we have got to tackle this like once and for all, that I'm actually not sure was as present when I started in this position.
And how about for you, Erick? Because as you sort of began saying earlier, I certainly hear people talk about the visibility of poverty in Edmonton differently than they talk about it in Calgary. I feel like it's more visible. So are things getting better or worse in Edmonton?
So yeah, to build on Meaghon's points, so in absolute numbers, worse. And I would say my emotional response to the question is much, much worse. I think that COVID bred a lot of isolation. And I think that isolation has really exacerbated the impact of poverty in particular. You're right, though, to your point, like it is more visible in Edmonton because of our downtown. Edmonton is a true thing, and Edmonton means like nobody is downtown after 4 o'clock.
Right.
During the pandemic, downtown was exclusively a space for people who were homeless and the police and nobody else. And you would go downtown and you would see, I wasn't downtown in the last 2 years where I did not see somebody who had overdosed. And so I don't know exactly what the situation in Calgary is, but like every single time I would go downtown, I would only see people who are homeless and the police and somebody performing some intervention. But I do think like the loneliness that the pandemic bred, I think is really, really, really important. Alberta Health Services looked at all of their hospitalization data because they were trying to predict who would be hospitalized. Like, what is the profile of somebody who's going to be hospitalized? All of their data did not allow them to predict who was going to be hospitalized. So then they overlaid social data on their hospitalization data, and they were able to predict with great consistency who is going to be hospitalized. And the most consistent predictor of who is going to be hospitalized, down to like 99.9%, was loneliness. If you're lonely, your likelihood of being hospitalized is very, very high. And so, like poverty, if you want to address poverty, it's not just an income thing. So if you want to fix our healthcare system, address loneliness. And I think COVID really has exacerbated that loneliness. And so if the symptom of loneliness is hospitalization, when it comes to poverty, loneliness is, I think, really, really grown under the pandemic in a way that I think we don't understand yet. But it's something that we should get our heads around, because that isolation, there are hundreds of thousands of Albertans who aren't going to show up on those sort of poverty radar that are now very much living a life of poverty.
Loneliness is a huge social determinant of health. Interesting.
That's doom and gloomy, and I'm not doom and gloomy about this, but I do think I don't want to be sensational about saying it's much, much worse, but it is much, much worse, and we need to be very aggressive in how we're going to respond to something that has emerged that we're not noticing.
I agree with that, Erick, fully. I think that is such an astute observation of one of the things that's different. There's the former Surgeon General in the United States, Dr. Vivek Murthy, who actually lived for a span of time in Newfoundland, which is kind of an unknown fact, had written a book about loneliness, and then also had made loneliness gave it as high a profile as smoking as a health determinant in the US. Wow. So that was sort of his banner cause. This was, of course, before the pandemic. And then he ended up serving on Fauci's, pandemic council about this and loneliness, screaming exactly what Erick was saying, that, if we don't account for this and how we're planning in health systems, then we're failing. We're absolutely failing. And I think how that's showing up for us in Calgary, I'm sure in Edmonton as well, is to understand who's in poverty right now, because we measure that often in a few ways. I mean, obviously there's the census data where piling through that right now. And there's also, who's reaching out for supports? What's the usership of that? People who are lonely and then start to almost have that self-stigma about poverty aren't reaching out. And I think that number is astronomical. I think loneliness, the self-stigma, and then not reaching out for support is colliding in a way that makes it so that we don't truly understand the magnitude of the problem yet.
No, and I like when you think about it intuitively, right? Like we can order our groceries, like we didn't have to leave our houses. Like we built all of this. We built an environment where loneliness is like very accessible now. Like you used to sort of
we made it easy.
Difficulty avoiding loneliness. Now you can lean into it aggressively, and it's not great, I think. And I don't know what our response is going to be, Meaghon, like what we as a society do, but I think it's something that we should be talking about a lot more, because it's endemic. What's the, like, it's a pandemic of loneliness. I don't know.
Yeah, endemic loneliness.
Yeah.
So the other kind of external factor in this experience is inflation and the rising cost of living. So can you talk to us about the impact that you're seeing or observing of the rising cost of living and inflation having on not just that kind of visible experience of poverty, but also that feeling that you were talking about earlier?
So inflation is hitting people in different, it's hitting us all in some of the same ways, and it's hitting people in poverty in very different ways. That inflation number, if we look at where things are right now, at least from a VCC perspective, costs have risen on average by about 6%. Wages have only gone up by about 1%, if we're being generous. So that's pretty self-explanatory and pretty clear right there in terms of people's purchasing power. And food has just gone through the absolute roof, right? So it's 11 to 15% in some cases in terms of what that looks like. And so that's having a huge toll on people, because you can't budget what you don't have. And one of the commentaries about people in poverty sometimes is like, oh, if they just budgeted better, then this is a failure to budget. And I think people in poverty are the most effective budgeters in our country, right? But you can't budget what you don't have, and food is just chomping out of that budget, as is unpredictability. So when we look at last winter in particular, and energy rates, right? Like people didn't know what they were going to be paying for their electricity, and that those bills were extraordinary. So, not knowing what's coming your way, combined with inflation and higher prices across the board, has had the obvious impact on people's ability to pay for their basic needs, and they're trading off on basic needs, and have been doing that for 3 years. Like constant conversations about rent versus food. Can I pay, the administration fee even on this medication, or am I going to buy a bus ticket to get my kid to somewhere? Like those are the conversations that are happening daily. And the long game of this is what's really hard. Like people have been in this for so long, 3 years plus if you were in poverty before that. The feeling of that now feels like it just, that there's a hopelessness to it. Every month when you hear these inflation numbers, I'm lined up for next Wednesday morning to do the media circuit on the next round of inflation, and the Bank of Canada and their adjustment. I think I've said to media a few times in the past 6 months, like, I'm just going to tell you the same thing I told you last month, the month before that, and the month before that. And you might as well probably stop calling on me, because I'm not going to give you anything different. Well, think about how that feels if you're living in poverty. It's just, there's just no hope on the horizon, and that's how it feels, right? And it's almost a resignation. I've heard from people in poverty talks of like, well, this is what this is now. And the challenge is that fewer people care about it, because we're tired. And I think that element of it is really kind of scary, because I think people do care. I think Albertans are very caring people. The best poverty reduction strategy is to get to know your neighbor. And if we can leverage that, that would be a really fantastic way forward for all of us. And I think people are feeling like nobody cares, because people are tired and people are showing up differently. And so that's kind of been, to your question, like kind of on the long game of this, and the impact of inflation and this affordability crisis. It's causing some depression, right? And not in a clinical way, just of where's the,
it keeps sort of hammering. Well, and I think you've talked about something that we've been partly focused on as well, which is the double whammy, or even the triple whammy that you're talking about, of inflation increasing, prices being one hit, relatively low wage growth being a second hit, and then the interest rate hikes being a potential third one, and which impacts people in different ways. But if they've got any kind of debt at a variable level, that's one more squeeze. And well, that might be the long-term answer. And thankfully, we're seeing what feels like the edge of inflation coming off, maybe just a little bit in the most recent numbers. So that might be a long-term solution. But in the short run, that's more money out of the family budget for anybody who's got anything variable at all.
Yeah. And, I know the jury is still out in terms of whether we're heading into a recession or a mild recession or a moderate recession. But even the fact that we're having that conversation, I think still contributes to that, okay, well, what am I in for next? What's going to be the next thing? And living in that constant state of bracing yourself is really challenging if you're living in poverty. Just doesn't allow you to lift up and see what might be possible.
Mm-hmm. And so when we were sitting down to write the questions for this, we had a section called tough questions. And I think there are some tough questions in the topic of poverty that sometimes we shy away from, but I think we all know each other well enough that I'm just going to ask them of you today. And one of them you began to allude to, but is about mental health and addictions. How intertwined are the issues of poverty and mental health and addictions in Alberta at the moment?
It's probably in the same sphere as like childcare and transportation when it comes to poverty. So, we break our work up into 8 pillars. We call them game changers, and mental health is one of them, but one of 8. So when it comes to poverty, overwhelmingly, you're talking about people who are working and struggling to get to tomorrow, to make a go for their family, to get their kids, graduated. Overwhelmingly, you're just talking about people who are low income and struggling. When it comes to mental health and addiction, where it's a big issue, is the homeless population. So people who are homeless often, overwhelmingly, are dealing with an extreme mental health issue or addictions or both. And so when it comes to the homeless, it's a big issue that we could spend a lot of time talking about. But when it comes to poverty, it's one of a series of issues, but not overwhelming. There's 130,000 people in Edmonton who live in poverty. The vast majority of them are not struggling with mental health or addictions. Well, mental health in terms of depression, maybe, but
the really extreme end. The folks that you were talking about when you told the story of walking downtown, what you'd see every day, the sort of really visible. You're saying that's a relatively small slice of the 130 or 40,000 people in Edmonton who are living in poverty.
Yeah, in Edmonton, that's 2,000 people who are on the streets and 130,000 people who are struggling with poverty. So you got 128,000 people who probably are not struggling with a serious mental health or addictions issue. I mean, I couldn't give you a percentage, but it's less of an issue compared to other things like affordable childcare or being able to pay for your bus pass.
Right. Meaghon, any build on that from your perspective?
Eric and I spend a lot of time talking about this because, and Eric, what I hear a little bit in your answer is like, there is a caution because what we're doing a bit or a lot in the media and sometimes in strategies, like downtown strategies and things like that across the country, is that we are conflating, criminality and poverty and addiction. And it's a really unhelpful conflation, actually, because there's a lot of stigmatization to that. It's not entirely true. There's a lot of nuance. And to Eric's point, what we see in terms of people who are houseless or homeless, who are in addiction, who might be relying on, crimes of poverty, to be able to manage an addiction is a very small part of what the whole poverty landscape looks like. And what I will say is that there is a lot of trauma in living in poverty, and our systems aren't equipped to deal with that. Dr. Gabor Mate, his latest book, it's called The Myth of Normal. It's really an amazing read, and it talks a lot about how none of our systems, particularly our justice system, can respond to the fact that, the trauma factor, right? The trauma factor of poverty and how we treat people in the criminal justice system, as an example, right? The instance of trauma amongst people who are in chronic poverty and not necessarily in transitory poverty is prevalent. It's higher than the general population, but the cause and effect tends to get a little bit confused, I think, when we're talking about it. And you can't just tackle one thing and then the other thing gets better. It's just like you can't tackle poverty rates by adding more jobs. You can't fix poverty by addressing mental illness. And it's just not that simple. And I think one of the challenges is that we want to make it simple. And we're trying to make it simple in this conversation about, addiction, C train stations, crime, like a social disorder. That's what we're trying to do in that poverty conversation. It's really tricky for people like Erick and I to be myth busting on that continually.
Yeah, I understand. Well, let's help make it simple a little bit. I want to talk to you about the pathways out of poverty. And I'll be honest with you, I think sometimes we say things like, we know what we have to do to end poverty, or we know what we have to do to address this. We also say things like, jobs alone won't do it. I find that sometimes we don't necessarily finish that sentence and say, what are those things that actually will really, really move the needle on poverty? So there's the tough question. What's it going to take to really move the needle to end poverty? Finish the sentence for us, and in simple terms, if we can.
In my opinion, what it will take is a community determined to end poverty. If you have a community that's determined to do that, I think it can happen. I think that Alberta is one of the very few places in the world where it's a possibility, where a community could have that determination to end poverty. And I think that we've often excluded a lot of really important people from being a part of the conversation. So Edmonton, as an example, the Downtown Business Association, the Chamber, a lot of the, how do we deal with social disorder downtown was government needs to solve the problem. Government, you got to do this. You got to get on it and solve the problem. And they've gotten so frustrated with government's lack of ability to solve the problem that they're starting to say, like, how do we solve this problem? And I think that's a big, important shift in thinking, that it's no longer somebody else's responsibility. I can play a role in this. And so business has always been engaged in terms of donating to a charity. Give us more myths so we can give them to the homeless. If businesses can start saying, what can we do to address this issue that we're seeing on our doorsteps, that changes things. So now it's the business community, the social services coming together, government obviously coming together, neighborhoods and communities coming together, and you can start addressing poverty. And so if a community is determined to do it, I think we can. And I think Alberta is one of the very few places in the world that has the mentality to actually get there. I'm a little bit more optimistic about Edmonton than I am about Calgary on that front. You're much better at your business community being involved, but we've never asked ours. And I think as our community is getting more, our business community is getting more engaged, they're realizing they've got solutions they can bring to the table, whether it's, they have a great mechanism for ending poverty, which is employment. So, but I think making it a community conversation, not a government fix this problem, social services fix this problem, we as a community are going to try to fix this problem. I think that's where I have optimism for, we could do this if we come together and bring all we have to bear to this issue.
To throw down there, Erick, on your Calgary versus Edmonton.
I can just validate for you that in virtually every conversation I have with a business leader in Edmonton over the last 6 months or so, issues of poverty and also downtown and downtown safety and things like that have come up, but in a new way too, for sure, where they're sort of saying, what role can we play in this? So Meaghon, Erick threw down the gauntlet and said he's more hopeful in Edmonton than in Calgary. How do you feel about that? And what's it going to take to end poverty in Calgary?
I'd say that hope isn't a plan, and Calgary is really good at taking action. So I think that might be a little bit different, but I fully do agree. All jokes aside with Erick, that like the full community ownership is required. So, we have a community well-being report that's coming out in February. We look at poverty and well-being across a lot of different indicators. 85% of Calgarians, for example, believe that everybody deserves a living wage. That's a huge thing. We know Erick commissioned a study of basic income, attitudes, and perceptions across the province a few years ago. Most people believe that people, should be taken care of at a level that meets their needs and are basically in support of a basic income. Anytime we do some sort of public perception survey, Albertans believe quite strongly that people should have meaningful quality of life, that no one deserves to be homeless, that, that we should be lifting each other up. I think the challenge is like how we own that and then how we convert that into action is the challenge. It's like the missing piece, and that's where it does take all of us. But I'd say two things to that. One is we almost have to, this is going to sound weird, and I'm not sure it's the right phrasing, but we also have to like shock ourselves into what we've become accustomed to. One of the things I get really frustrated about is how we celebrate high numbers for social service agencies across the province. You asked a tough question. I'm just going to throw out a controversial answer. So, the food bank, for example, across the country, across North America, plays a very necessary function. But the food bank was meant to be an emergency measure 50 years ago that was meant to wind down. And now it has become part of our expected, it's always going to be there, safety net. At Christmas time, we celebrate the fact that, we raised 60,000 pounds of food and millions of dollars. And there's music and celebration and dancing. And I think there's a lot of us that sit at the other side of that and go, that's shameful. That is shameful that we need that much, because at the other end of what was just contributed are families that are hungry and can't eat. And why on earth are we celebrating in the annual reports and everything else that we served more clients than ever this year? And that's what people are programmed to donate to. So there is this thing that needs to happen, I think. And I'm going to look to Erick and see whether he agrees with me.
I want to pile on.
Yeah.
As soon as you're done, I'm piling on.
Why on earth have we made this normal? We're in Canada, and Alberta is the land of riches in Canada. And we're going, we're going to help the food bank, and let's build another domestic violence shelter. And like, wow, look, they served so many people this year and they want to serve more people next year. All right. And we celebrate it. And it is, to me, from a mind shift and paradigm perspective, like one of the things that has to change in order for that community ownership to start to happen. Like, we have to say, like, absolutely not. This is nothing to celebrate. I'm going to donate to organizations who show me fewer numbers of people served because we actually solved something in the system. And so for me, like, that's how I'll add to your community ownership part, is like, people want things to be better, but what we're rewarding is the wrong thing.
It needs to be more solving the problem than serving the problem, is kind of the wording that has always resonated with me. Erick, you wanted to go pile on.
The food banks are the ones that I agree, Meaghon. Like we talk like, and I would say there's not a food bank that doesn't want to put itself out of business, but what generates revenue is growth and more, and it's very sexy. I'm with you. Like, if we can figure out how to shock ourselves to not normalize those things, like more people need hampers, more beds for homeless people. Like, if we can get upset about that, I think that. And I firmly believe that we're a very smart group of people in Alberta who can solve problems, but we have to get either agitated or upset. And Scott, to your point, the conversation in Edmonton, the downtown community said we went from empathy to apathy to anger when it comes to our homeless people. And now they're getting to that anger is leading them to be constructive about solutions. And so that's great. Good. I'm glad we're in that space where our anger is leading us to action, as opposed to like apathy or normalizing what we're seeing going on in our community.
Right. Like, let's get angry at the right things. Because the thing that's happened in Calgary is that, transit riders are angry at, people who are maybe
The people themselves sometimes. Yeah.
Right. And everybody has a right to expect safety. And there are reasons, I don't travel on public transit late at night. Like, I get it. And we're getting angry at each other when we need to be getting angry at policies and government, and targeting that sort of energy at the places where people can make those decisions to actually end that situation, because it can end.
Yeah, angry at the problem, not the people. We're beginning to close in on the last couple of questions here, but one of the places I wanted to go is Alberta is in a boom right now. We're back in another boom, and there's talk of recessions on the horizon in Canada and globally. But our economists here at the Business Council would say Alberta's probably going to be a port in that storm. We're probably going to fare better than most, maybe not even slip into recession. And just to tell you a quick story, I always remember years and years ago when I was in my early 20s and I was going to university, I was working at a coffee shop making $9 an hour and happened to be taking economics at the time. And I remember hearing on the radio one morning the great news that Alberta was in a boom, and it was sort of celebrated on the radio, as it often is, and as it should be. And I thought about my own situation, and I was like, my rent just went up. Everything just got more expensive. And actually, I don't see how this boom is good news to me in this moment. I'm taking economics in school, so I know it's good news in the big picture and in the long run. So that's a long way to get around to, if we're in a boom, how do we make that shared? What's the impact of a boom on people who are in poverty, and how can we help them benefit from a strong economic situation that we're in?
And Scott, what you say about your experience, I think is something that people, for example, on the Poverty Talks Committee of Vibrant Communities say a lot about previous boom times, like in the 80s, 90s, whatever. Like, When people want to harken back to the good old days of Calgary or of Alberta, what you'll often hear from people who've lived in poverty for a long time is like, wasn't good for everybody. That was never good for everybody. And so it's an important question because, how do we make it good for everybody? Again, Calgary ranking second for income inequality, in Canada, gives us part of the insight to the answer there. And how do we start to lift that floor for people in Alberta who live in poverty to get them closer? I mean, it's been an interesting conversation with the surplus and how we're using that. Erick and I often talk about how we're really good at servicing poverty. We throw a lot of money into servicing poverty. So poverty costs Albertans about $9.8 billion. That's billion dollars per year as a province, and that money directed into solutions like affordable housing, long range things instead of shelters, for example, making sure that raising minimum wage, all of those sorts of things are possible, and we have money to do it. And so I think concentrating on the people who aren't benefiting from that great wealth and targeting long-term solutions and not just I'm in office for 4-year solutions. And that's not a partisan statement. That's been every government in Canada, right?
Yeah, long-term solutions are hard for governments to think about who are thinking in 4-year windows of every sort. Right?
You invest now and you might not see the results of that for 30 years. And that's not great sometimes when you are running for office. But we do have to almost bite that bullet and actually just start to invest in it, even if those returns aren't quick. And the reason that we invest in servicing poverty is because it's a quick return. And that looks good in the moment, but it's not going to tackle it. And no one's going to prosper from all those boom times if we don't actually tackle the systemic part of this in a really meaningful way immediately. What do you think, Erick?
So I'll talk to who I envision your audience is, or who's listening to this. Who I envision it's the CEOs and the power brokers of Alberta who are tuning in to this podcast. So
there are definitely some of those folks. Absolutely.
Yeah, I would speak to them. So what I would say is that in boom times, behavior doesn't change, which is really, really counterintuitive in my mind. Like, you should be taking advantage of the opportunities that a boom creates, and behavior doesn't change. So in these boom times, there's a lot of unfilled jobs, and behavior doesn't change to fill those jobs. So what industry should do, in my mind, is create mechanisms to fill the jobs that they need filled. So there's a steel company in Edmonton. They have 60 unfilled jobs. Things are booming for them. They're not changing their behavior and their hiring practices. What they could, and I think should do, is start targeting newcomer communities and Indigenous communities and women and youth and say, how do we bring you into the labor force? What is missing in our environment that isn't allowing us to get you into our employment field? Those 60 jobs will remain unfilled if they don't change their behavior. And so, I mean, we're working with them to change their behavior. So it's not the best example trying to change. But
I understand what you're saying, though. There's 100,000 open jobs in Alberta right now. That filling those jobs could go a really long way to alleviating poverty for a lot of folks.
And the bottom line for these companies will grow if they figure out how to do that. But what they're not doing is changing their behavior. So they're not saying, how do we bring you into our labor force? And if they do that, they solve one. They help reduce poverty, which is great from Meaghon and I, and hopefully will put us out of business, but they address their need. And so instead of turning to government to say, like, build the labor force so that when I put my job on, LinkedIn, it gets filled. Target those groups, bring them in, train them, whatever barriers that exist, address them so that your labor force needs are met, as opposed to looking to government to do that. So that's what I would say, like, during boom times, like, change your behavior and you win and our communities will win. If you don't, basically the growth happens for the existing group of people. So incomes will go up or shareholders will receive bigger dividends. It's not transformative, but booms create a transformative environment. And so transform the environment, take advantage of what exists here, because your behavior does change when things are bad. And so it seems intuitive that they should change when things are good. So you maximize the opportunity that's created by a booming environment.
That's fascinating. So we have like 2 minutes left, and I'll give you each 60 seconds. Can you share a final thought or insight that you would like our listeners to take away with? Erick, maybe I'll start with you.
So I introduced Meaghon to somebody from Alberta Health Services that I met because he was fascinating. That loneliness stat I gave you came from him. The number one cost to our healthcare system is high blood pressure. It's the most expensive disease in the healthcare system. Number 2 is diabetes. And number 3 is like respiratory, like asthma. Like heart disease is number 4. So like one of those sort of typical health concerns we have, like heart disease seems like it should be number 1, or cancer should be number 1, isn't. The most expensive group of people in our healthcare system, they consume 65% of the healthcare budget goes to frail seniors. Like you think it would be like the homeless population because they're so expensive. It's frail seniors. It's seniors that have bad bones. And so I think like my thought to you would be like, let's tackle some of these things that aren't intuitive. So like mine would be loneliness. Like I'm obsessed with it now. If loneliness saves our healthcare system billions of dollars, can't we tackle that as a community? Like it just seems intuitive that instead of signing up to be a snow angel in Edmonton, which is the people who shovel sidewalks, I should go to my neighbor and say, hey, I noticed you're struggling to shovel your sidewalk. I'll do that, and let's have a cup of tea afterwards. Like those are the things that are so tangible. And so I would just like, that would be my final thought. Like, let's be a part of a solution, because the solution is surprisingly easy. Like that we could reduce, hospitalization by having a cup of tea with our neighbor. Like that's mind blowing to me. And so my thought is just like, if we could do something that easy and address something as big as health,
Right.
We have these things that are just so in our grasp. We don't even have to struggle to find them. They're right there. And so it's to think about those things, to tackle things that are just so in front of us. That was probably more than 60 seconds.
Meaghon, final thought to you.
Best poverty reduction strategy we have is to get to know your neighbor, and you can do that today. To Erick's point, go meet your neighbor. Meet your neighbor, knock on their door. Seems strange, but like actually do it. And the minute we started making backyards and drive-in garages instead of front porches is when this all sort of changed for us, right? And so like, how do we recreate that? So that's one thing that people can do. We have reasons to be optimistic. Our community well-being report that's coming out in February shows that, in Calgary, the rate of poverty has decreased, and that income has grown most significantly for the bottom 10% of the population, people who live in poverty. So we can do it, and we are doing it, and it's a solvable problem. And, let's get mad at the right things. Let's get angry when we should. Let's not shy away from that. And then let's channel that into action, because it is possible and we can do it. And now is a great time to do it, to Erick's point.
And that is an incredibly powerful note to leave this conversation. I want to thank you both for your time and just spending this hour discussing this issue with us.
Well, thank you for joining us for this episode of The Brief, an Alberta Better podcast series. This podcast is a production of the Business Council of Alberta, and you can learn more about us at businesscouncilab.com. And we'd love to connect with you on social media, so give us a follow at BizCouncilAB on Twitter, LinkedIn, TikTok, and YouTube. And finally, don't forget to subscribe and rate the show and give us a quick review. Your support helps us to keep making more episodes. Alberta Better is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts. New episodes drop every other Tuesday. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.